Over 1,600 earthquakes in 2 days. That is not a typo, and that is not last year's headline. That is what Spain's own Instituto Geográfico Nacional confirmed happening beneath Tenerife just this past week. So what is actually going on underneath that island, beneath one of the most dangerous volcanic systems in Europe? And why are locals suddenly asking the question nobody wants to say out loud on a Spanish holiday island? Is this the one that finally breaks the silence? Because here's the thing, guys. This isn't the first swarm. We've talked about this year. Not even close. This is now the 10th documented episode of unusual seismic activity beneath Teide since February alone. And if you zoom out further, official records list swarms stretching back to October of 2016, then June 2019, then twice. In 2022, once in November of 2024, once in August of 2025, and then a cluster of them packed into February of this year alone. That's not a pattern of nothing to see here. That's a mountain that keeps clearing its throat over and over, closer together every single time. So let's get into the actual numbers from this latest episode, because the data is honestly what should be making headlines, and instead, it's buried in agency reports written in language, so careful. It borderline sounds like it's trying not to scare anyone. The swarm began the night of July 22nd this year, and by the time IGN's automated systems finished processing, they had detected around 1,600 separate seismic events in just 2 days. Manual analysis, the slower, more careful process, where a real human scientist confirms each signal, identified roughly 100 confirmed earthquakes between July 22nd and 23rd alone, with automated systems flagging. Over 500 more on top of that. Every single one of these events was concentrated in the exact same danger zone, the western area of Las Cañadas del Teide, directly beneath the municipalities of Guía de Sora, Villaflor de Chasna, and Santiago del Teide, sitting at depths between 10 and 15 kilometers underground. That's not random scattered noise across the island. That is one specific, tightly clustered zone, lighting up again and again right under the volcano's own skirt. And here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because just 1 week before that, on July 3rd, INVOLCAN, the Canary Islands Volcanological Institute, recorded what they classified as a hybrid seismic swarm, running for nearly 5 hours straight, from just after 6 in the evening until close to 11 at night. Hybrid events aren't just rock cracking under stress the way a normal tectonic earthquake works. Hybrid signals are the fingerprint of something moving, specifically fluid, gas, or magmatic material, shifting through cracks deep inside a volcanic system. INVOLCAN itself confirmed this was officially the 14th hybrid event swarm recorded on the island since 2016. 14. And notice the acceleration in that timeline, years apart in the early 2010s, and now practically monthly clusters through 2026. When the frequency of a volcano's tremors starts compressing like that, scientists don't panic, but they absolutely start watching a lot more closely, and so should you if you've got a trip to Tenerife booked, or family living there right now. Now here's the part that's actually splitting opinion between officials and locals, and it's the exact same tension we've seen play out on other volcanic islands before. IGN's director, Itaiza Dominguez, has gone on record multiple times saying there is no evidence pointing to an increased short-term or medium-term eruption risk, and that the current activity remains consistent with the pattern seen in February, March, and June of this year. The majority of these thousands of tremors were reportedly too weak to even be felt by residents on the surface, with magnitudes staying below 0.7 to 0.8 on the local scale in most cases. Officials say the threshold that would actually worry them is a shift towards stronger earthquakes, something above magnitude 2.5, strong enough for the public to physically feel, paired with clear evidence of magma actively moving toward the surface. Right now, they say, neither of those two conditions have been met. That's the official position. Calm, measured, backed by over 100 monitoring stations across the island. But ask a local who's lived through swarm after swarm after swarm since 2016, and you'll get a very different tone entirely. Because here's the real tension driving the story, and it's the same one that's ignited public anger on volcanic islands from Italy to the Canaries before. Locals are asking whether a green alert level, unchanged through year after year of escalating tremor counts, is actually a scientific judgment, or whether it's become a political and economic comfort blanket for an island whose entire economy runs on tourism. Tenerife pulls in millions of visitors every single year, drawn by Teide National Park, by the beaches, by the volcano itself as a tourist attraction. A yellow alert doesn't mean evacuation. It doesn't mean an eruption is imminent. But it absolutely changes the headlines. It absolutely changes hotel bookings, and it absolutely puts pressure on an economy that depends on people believing everything is fine. So is the alert level reflecting the actual seismic data, Or is it reflecting what the island can afford for the world to read on a travel forum this summer? That's the question we're digging into next. Let's talk about why this specific swarm is different from just background noise, because the science here actually matters. And once you understand it, you'll see exactly why locals are refusing to just accept the word normal anymore. Remember those hybrid events I mentioned, the ones in Vulcan confirmed as the 14th swarm of their kind since 2016. Hybrid signals are considered scientifically significant because they combine two different wave signatures in a single event, a sharp, high-frequency onset that behaves like a normal rock fracture earthquake, followed immediately by a longer, lower-frequency tail that behaves completely differently, the kind of signal you get when fluid, gas, or magmatic material is actively moving and resonating through cracks and conduits deep underground. In plain language, a hybrid event is the sound of something down there shifting, not just the crust settling. And officials themselves, in their own careful phrasing, have described this ongoing activity as consistent with fluid circulation at depth, possibly linked to hydrothermal volatiles of magmatic origin. Strip away the bureaucratic wrapping on that sentence, and what you're left with is this. Something hot, pressurized, and tied to the volcano's own magmatic system is on the move beneath Teide, and it has been, repeatedly, for years. Now let's talk depth, because that's the second piece of this puzzle that officials keep coming back to. Every single event in this recent swarm, all 1,600 of them, plus the 14th hybrid swarm before it, were located at depths between 10 and 15 kilometers, sometimes reported as shallow as 7 kilometers in earlier episodes this year. That's not surface cracking from erosion or settling ground. That's deep crust, right in the zone where scientists say Teide's hydrothermal and magmatic systems interact. The consistency of that depth range across swarm after swarm since 2016 is exactly why researchers keep saying this reflects an active volcanic system rather than isolated, unrelated tectonic noise. It's the same source, activating again and again in the same place, at the same depth, just with growing frequency. And here's a fact that puts the historical weight of this island in perspective. The last actual eruption on Tenerife happened all the way back in 1909 at the Teide Volcano, and it lasted just 10 days before going quiet. Before that, you have to go back to Narices del Teide in 1798, Garachico in 1706, and Siete Fuentes, Fasnia, and Arafo in 1704 and 1705. This is a volcanic system with a documented centuries-long history of eventually doing exactly what volcanoes do. The only real question is timing, and right now, nobody, not IGN, not INVOLCAN, not any independent seismologist watching this data, can actually tell you that timing with certainty. So here's where the public frustration boils over, and I think it's genuinely worth walking through both sides fairly before you decide who you believe. IGN maintains that for this to become a genuine short-term concern, they would need to see earthquakes above magnitude 2.5, strong enough for residents to physically feel, combined with clear evidence of magma actively rising toward the surface, ground deformation spiking, and gas emissions increasing beyond background levels. Right. Now, by their own public statements, none of those thresholds have been crossed. The vast majority of this swarm's earthquakes stayed below magnitude 0.8, genuinely too weak for a person standing on the surface to notice at all. That is a legitimate, scientifically grounded position, and it's not fair to dismiss it as pure spin. Monitoring networks with over 100 stations across the island are picking up signals most human beings simply cannot feel, and reacting to every single one of those with public alarm would create exactly the kind of fatigue where residents stop paying attention altogether, the boy who cried wolf problem that experienced observers on these islands know all too well from prior volcanic crises elsewhere. But here's the counter-argument, and it's the one gaining real traction in local communities right now. Critics point out that the sheer frequency of these swarms has been steadily compressing over the past several years, from isolated years-apart episodes in the mid-2010s to now, effectively, 10 separate swarms in 2026, alone, spanning February straight through July. That acceleration itself, they argue, is data, and it deserves public discussion regardless of whether any single earthquake crosses a felt magnitude threshold. Their argument isn't that an eruption is imminent tomorrow, and to be clear, nobody credible on either side of this debate is claiming that. Their argument is that the actual public conversation has become dangerously narrow, fixated entirely on the single question of, will it erupt soon? While the much bigger, much more urgent question, what happens after an eruption starts? Ash fallout, evacuation logistics, communication infrastructure, tourism, collapse, gets almost no public attention at all. And on an island hosting well over 1 million visitors during peak season, with an international airport, dense coastal roads, and beach resorts built directly in the shadow of an active stratovolcano, that gap in preparation planning is exactly what has residents genuinely worried Not the swarm itself, but the silence around what comes next. If the swarm ever does escalate into something more, that's exactly the conversation we're moving into next. The preparedness question nobody in an official capacity seems eager to answer out loud. So let's ask the question almost nobody in an official capacity wants to answer clearly. If Teide actually did start moving toward eruption, is Tenerife actually ready? And the honest, uncomfortable answer, based on what residents and independent observers have been saying publicly, is that the preparedness conversation is nowhere near where it needs to be for an island of this size. Hosting this many visitors, sitting directly beside an active stratovolcano with a documented eruptive history stretching back centuries. Local voices following this swarm closely have pointed out something that should genuinely alarm anyone paying attention. There are currently no clearly communicated evacuation routes published for residents, no confirmed evacuation centers that the public has been briefed on, and no widely available public plan explaining what happens in the hours after an alert level actually gets raised. That's not a minor administrative gap. On an island where the last eruption was in 1909, an entire century of population growth, tourism, expansion, and infrastructure development has happened without a single generation living through what an actual evacuation scenario on this island would even look like. And that gap becomes even more concerning when you consider the sheer scale of who's actually on that island at any given moment during peak season. Tenerife pulls in well over 1 million tourists annually, many of them concentrated on the southern and western coasts, precisely the direction that historical lava flows and any future eruption from the Las Cañadas region would most likely travel toward. Think through the actual logistics for a moment. If an eruption ever did begin, and lava or ash disruption forced airspace closures, how exactly do you move over 1 million tourists off an island using ferries and reduced flight capacity on roads that could simultaneously be blocked by ashfall, landslides, or evacuating traffic jams from residents trying to leave at the same time? This isn't a hypothetical dreamed up for dramatic effect. It's the exact kind of logistical nightmare that emergency planners on volcanic islands worldwide have had to model for real. And it's precisely the kind of scenario critics say Tenerife's current public communication has almost entirely failed to address. The debate isn't whether tourists would need to be told to leave the beach, it's whether the infrastructure to actually move that many people safely and quickly even exists in a documented, rehearsed form. Now, to be balanced about this, because that's genuinely important here, INVOLCAN and IGN are not amateur outfits. Both agencies operate serious monitoring infrastructure. Over 100 seismic stations combined across the island, continuously, tracking earthquake location, magnitude, depth, and signal type in real time. Both have consistently and publicly stated, through this entire swarm sequence stretching from February through July of this year, that current conditions do not represent a change of scenario, and that the probability of an eruption in the coming months or years remains low based on everything they're currently observing. That is not spin invented on the spot. It reflects a genuinely cautious, data-driven scientific position, and dismissing it entirely would be just as irresponsible as ignoring the concerns on the other side. The frustration voiced by critics isn't really that officials are lying about the raw seismic numbers. It's that the public conversation built around those numbers has stayed narrowly fixated on the eruption or not question, while almost nothing gets said publicly about what actually happens logistically once an alert level does change, whenever that eventually happens. And that's where the trust problem becomes real, because here's the pattern residents describe. Swarm happens, numbers get published, officials say it's within the range of previous episodes, alert stays green. Weeks pass, another swarm happens, same pattern repeats, 10 times just since February of this year alone. At what point does a repeating pattern like that stop being reassuring and start feeling like fatigue by design? That's the exact psychological trap that residents on volcanic islands everywhere eventually fall into. And it's the same dynamic we've seen debated around other active volcanic systems in Europe over the past several years, where unrest simmers for extended periods without ever crossing into a higher official alert tier. The frustration isn't necessarily that the science is wrong. It's that a population living directly on top of centuries-old lava fields, in the shadow of a mountain that has erupted repeatedly throughout recorded history, deserves a much clearer, much more transparent public conversation about contingency planning, not just repeated reassurances that today's numbers still fall within an acceptable range. So where does that leave things right now, heading into the back half of this year? The swarm that began July 22nd has, according to the latest reporting, already tapered off, with automated detections dropping significantly by the following afternoon before a smaller, secondary cluster of low-magnitude repetitive events picked up again later that same night. That kind of start-stop pulsing pattern is actually fairly consistent with what INVOLCAN and IGN have documented in prior 2026 episodes, this isn't necessarily the sign of an unprecedented new phase, but it is one more entry in an accelerating year that has already produced 10 separate swarms since February. Whether the next entry on that list comes next month or next year, nobody currently monitoring this data can say for certain. But the direction of that frequency curve and the widening gap between what instruments are recording and what the public conversation actually addresses is exactly why this story isn't going away anytime soon. In the final section, I want to bring this all together, what independent observers are actually calling for right now, how this compares to unrest patterns seen at other major volcanic systems in Europe, and what residents and travelers alike should actually be watching for going forward. So let's bring this all together, because after 10 swarms since February, after 1,600 earthquakes in just 2 days, and after a 14th documented hybrid event sequence since 2016, the real story here isn't a single dramatic escalation. It's a slow, steady compression of time between episodes that deserves genuine attention without tipping into unnecessary panic. What independent observers and concerned locals are actually calling for is not a change in the science itself, but a change in how that science gets communicated and acted upon. The recurring demand that keeps surfacing in public discussion is the creation of a truly independent volcanological observatory for the Canary Islands, one funded directly by the state rather than answering to regional tourism-dependent politics, modeled on institutions like the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory in the United States, or Iceland's Meteorological Office, both of which are widely respected precisely because their funding and reporting structures are insulated from short-term economic pressure. The argument isn't that IGN or INVOLCAN are fabricating data. Both agencies clearly publish detailed, technical, time-stamped reports that any independent researcher can cross-check. The argument is that the interpretation of that data, and more importantly, the public messaging built around it, may be shaped by incentives that have nothing to do with pure seismology. It's worth comparing this directly to what's been playing out at Campi Flegrei near Naples, Italy, over the same recent period, because the parallel is almost impossible to ignore. That volcanic system has spent years in a state of persistent unrest, repeated earthquake swarms, measurable ground deformation, and elevated alert levels that Italian authorities have adjusted incrementally rather than dramatically, introducing intermediate alert classifications, specifically so they wouldn't have to jump straight from a calm status to a high alert one. Residents near Naples have voiced almost identical frustrations to what we're now hearing out of Tenerife, a sense that monitoring agencies are threading an impossibly fine needle between avoiding public panic and maintaining public trust, and that economic pressure, tourism in one case, dense urban population and property values in the other, inevitably factors into how cautiously or aggressively an alert level gets adjusted. Neither situation means officials are acting in bad faith. It means that volcanic risk communication anywhere in the world sits at a genuinely difficult intersection of hard science, public psychology, and economic reality, and no island or city has fully solved that problem yet. Now, here's what actually matters for anyone watching this unfold in real time, whether you live on Tenerife, have family there, or have a trip booked in the coming months. First, understand what the current data genuinely does and does not show. Thousands of small tremors, the majority below magnitude of 0.8, and physically unfelt by the population, concentrated at depths of 10 to 15 kilometers beneath the western Las Cañadas region, consistent with fluid or gas movement within an active hydrothermal and magmatic system. That is real, confirmed, documented activity, not an official cover-up of non-existent numbers. Second, understand what officials say would actually change their assessment. Earthquakes crossing above magnitude 2.5, strong enough to be felt directly by residents, combined with measurable ground deformation and rising gas emissions, signaling magma genuinely approaching the surface. As of the most recent reporting, none of those specific thresholds have been documented. Third, and this is the piece that deserves the most public attention going forward, understand that the debate over evacuation planning, transportation logistics for over 1 million seasonal visitors, and clear public communication protocols exists entirely separately from the eruption or not question, and according to residents and independent observers, that planning conversation remains seriously underdeveloped regardless of which side of the alert level debate you personally find more convincing. So is Tenerife sitting on a ticking volcanic time bomb, or is this simply the ordinary, well-documented rhythm of an active volcanic island going through its normal cycles of unrest, exactly as it has multiple times since 2016, without ever tipping into eruption? Based on everything currently published by IGN and INVOLCAN, the honest answer sits somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. The volcano is not erupting. Nothing in the current data suggests an imminent eruption in the coming days or weeks. But the frequency of these swarms has genuinely accelerated through 2026. The underlying mechanism, fluid and gas hosting this many people every single season, That combination, real geological activity plus a real communication and preparedness gap, is exactly why locals are genuinely on edge right now, and why dismissing their concerns as simple overreaction misses half of what's actually going on beneath the surface, quite literally. If you're watching this from Tenerife or anywhere in the Canary Islands, stay engaged with official INVOLCAN and IGN updates, because despite the criticism around messaging, the raw data they publish remains the most reliable real-time source available to the public. And if you're planning a trip there or have family on the island, this is exactly the kind of story worth revisiting regularly rather than checking once and assuming nothing has changed. Because as we've seen through 10 separate swarms since February alone, this situation is clearly still evolving. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Is this island prepared enough for what its own volcano has done repeatedly throughout recorded history? Or is the silence around evacuation planning the real story here? Subscribe so you don't miss the next update the moment new seismic data comes in, because with a system this active, the next swarm is genuinely a matter of when, not if. I'll see you in the next one.